let's start with this new bill from the United States to Ukraine, Taiwan, and Israel. In your opinion, what would that mean for the conflict in Ukraine, politically and militarily?
Well, let's start with what it really means. It just means that there's an election coming up in the United States, and the military-industrial complex is getting hungry. It needs to be fed, and it needs to be fed because it has to provide campaign financing to all of the senators and congressmen who support defense spending. And also, I think the Pentagon is in favor because of all the weapons that they've shipped to the Ukraine with nothing to show for it. The weapon stockpiles need to be replenished. So that is mostly what this bill is about. It has very little to do with the Ukraine, Israel, or Taiwan. And least of all, it has to do with the Ukraine, because at this point, everybody knows that the Ukraine has lost. So I think this bill, in the context of the Ukraine, is pretty much nothing. And I think it's pretty much a waste of time to even talk about it. I think it's interesting that the United States, the federal treasury, has to roll over the amount of debt equivalent to a third of the American economy within the next year or so, which is basically a debt spiral. It basically has to take on more and more debt in order to continue functioning. And the way it ends inevitably in every single case is with a default, a federal default. And right now, the fact that all of these foreigners that used to buy into US foreign debt are now reluctant to do so basically means that we're looking at the end of this ability to endlessly spend money that doesn't exist, basically conjuring it into existence, exporting inflation and all of that. And the fact that as part of this legislation, this legislative drive in the US, they've legalized, or quote unquote, legalized the process of stealing Russian money, will hasten the process by which the US dollar will stop being internationally recognized and used as a medium of exchange. So these are all the things that are important, and the Ukraine is not very important at all, I would say, at this point.
In your opinion, if they go along with this plan of seizuring the Russian assets, what would that mean for Russia, and how that would affect the relationship between Russia and the United States?
There is no relationship between Russia and the United States. They haven't really broken diplomatic relations and recalled ambassadors yet, although Americans have arrested a certain amount of Russian sovereign territory that is on US soil and are refusing to give it back. So that's a bad sign. There is a good question as to what purpose having a US embassy in Moscow and a Russian embassy in Washington serves at this point. But basically, there is no relationship. What stealing Russian money will do is send a very powerful message to the rest of the world, which is that the US can no longer be trusted with other nations' money, that everybody should basically pull their money out of US banks and out of US Treasury paper and other dollar-denominated investments as quickly as possible. And it will turbocharge the drive of the BRICS nations, which are now called BRICS 20, I guess, to basically get rid of the US dollar altogether. in international transactions, in international trade. That's what it really means.
Do you see any similarities between what's going on in Ukraine and what we've seen in Afghanistan with the case that United States just left Afghanistan and they stopped talking about it?
Oh, there's similarity between the Ukraine and Afghanistan and Iraq and Niger at this point, and Korea and Vietnam. The US always fights wars for as long as they're profitable. As soon as they stop being profitable, the US pretends that they won or something like that, and they pull out. And since the Americans have the attention span of a tropical fish, they don't really remember the last time it happened. How many Americans still think about Afghanistan? As many Americans as could never find it on a map still can't find it on a map. So none of this really matters. And yes, the Ukraine will be a much bigger embarrassment for the United States government than Afghanistan, because here it is right in the center of geographic Europe. But it will, that point will be appreciated mostly by the Europeans and the rest of the world, not so much by the Americans, and never mind the American voters, whoever they are.
We've learned that the United States sent long-range missiles to Ukraine, and they reported this in New York Times. And in your opinion, at the same time, we're hearing that NATO is talking about going on offensive against Russia and sending troops to Ukraine. And when it comes to this type of rhetoric on the part of NATO and the United States, do you think it's part of the political campaign for what's going on in the United States for the sake of domestic policy for 2024 for Joe Biden?
Oh, I don't know what Biden needs in terms of domestic policy. Basically, the entire political realm in the United States is in the midst of psychotic rage. I don't think any rational calculation can be applied to that particular equation. They ship those weapons because they have them, and because they would like to see them used, because then they'd get to order more and spend even more money and get even more campaign contributions from the maker, and etc. It also gives them a chance of posturing and acting dangerous, which is probably important for some senatorial and congressional races. I don't think anything is going to help Joe Biden except maybe dropping dead. That would definitely be helpful, but somewhat unlikely to happen, seeing as they're keeping him alive against all odds. In terms of what these weapons will do in the small quantities in which they're going to be or have been provided, it won't make that big a difference. The worst that might happen is that Russian air defenses will screw up, and one of these will land on the territory of one of the nuclear power plants in Russia that they can actually reach. That is potentially a very large problem. But the hope is that these weapons will be destroyed before the Ukrainians get to launch them, together with the American crews, the ground crews that are in charge of these weapon systems, since the Ukrainians have no idea how to use them, how to fire them. And the Russians have said that. The military commanders in Russia have said that they will do their best to destroy any new weapons that reach the Ukraine from the West well before they reach the front. And the Russians are very actively disrupting and destroying Ukrainian logistics in supplying weapons to the front. So there's hope that these weapons will never be used.
In your opinion, if they already know that the Ukraine case is already done, and why they're continuing this conflict, this war in Ukraine? Are they trying to send some sort of messages to China, to what's going on between China and the United States in Taiwan? Why they're trying to continue this war? This is a big question.
Oh, I think it's pretty simple. I think that if Russia scores a huge victory prior to the election, that will register, and that will cause Joe Biden to lose. Joe Biden might lose anyway. But the Russians, and Putin in particular, said that he is basically a big fan of Joe Biden. He really likes the idea of a complete idiot in charge of the United States and would like Joe Biden to win. So chances are the Russians will not rock the boat too much prior to the US elections in the hopes that Joe Biden gets another 4 years, because that would be quite copacetic as far as the Russians are concerned. Whereas if Trump gets in, Trump is unpredictable. He's a tempestuous character. Um, the Biden camp, because Biden doesn't actually, his brain doesn't work, so he doesn't make any decisions. But his cabinet is very well known to the Russian special services, and they can pretty much model their behavior depending on what happens in the world. They're all basically very predictable people who don't have any new ideas. And that's the good thing about them, is that, they can't come up with anything new. Whereas what Trump will do is within the realm of uncertainty. And so the Russians really want Biden to win and continue this track of slow decay in the United States, because that's good for Russia. It leaves Russia pretty well, alone, gives it a free hand to grow its industrial potential, grow its economy, make deals with the rest of the world, basically continue doing what it's been doing quite successfully for quite some time now. So I don't think that there's going to be any major moves as far as upsetting the political calculation in the United States perpetuated by Russia.
But whenever we talk about Ukraine, we have to consider that China is behind the scene, because they say in the United States, they always talk about containing China and just sending message to China. Then they cannot do the same in Taiwan as Russia did in Ukraine. And how do you see this type of mindset on the part of the United States? Because in this new bill, we see three countries, Ukraine, Taiwan, and Israel, getting aid from the United States. It seems that the same policy that they apply to Ukraine, they would apply to Taiwan. And in your opinion, at the end of the day, what would be their end game in Taiwan?
Well, I know what China's end game in Taiwan is. It's to join it to the mainland politically, basically the Hong Kong solution, with maybe some differences. Um, Taiwan is internationally recognized as being Chinese, so there isn't really a diplomatic problem there. The only real problem is that the United States keeps interfering and meddling in Taiwanese politics. But China is quite patient and will wait for the events to run their course, and will wait for Taiwan to rejoin the mainland um, on friendly terms without it involving any military action. Um, as far as military action, well, again, it all has to do with the care and feeding of uh, of the um, the American defense establishment. It's going to get most of the money that's slated for Taiwan. Taiwan will get a pittance. That's what usually happens. Everybody's pockets have to be lined within the United States before any of the war material leaks out to anywhere else in the world. And so basically, as I said, it was time to feed the military industrial complex in the United States because there are elections on the way, and elections have to be funded. And the way they're funded in the United States is through kickbacks from the defense establishment to the politicians. So that's the thing to pay attention to, not the pretense of international politics that the US still tries to maintain.
We know that Olaf Scholz, Janet Yellen, Olaf Scholz, and right now Antony Blinken have been visiting China, and they were trying to convince Chinese that to not support Russia in this conflict in Ukraine. And when you see these type of political behavior on the part of the United States, do you think they support Taiwan against China, and right now they're trying to convince Chinese to not support Russia in the conflict in Ukraine? Does it make sense to you?
Well, I think that there are two games being played. One is a sort of posturing game on the part of American and European politicians, where they act important by flying to China and being received. And the real content of the discussions and the real protocol of the meetings is not really discussed in American or Western press. Basically, it tries to show their people in the best possible light. And a completely different game is being played by the Chinese, which is strictly a humiliation game. So, for instance, Ursula von der Leyen flies to Beijing and is sent through passport control because the European Union is not a country. And diplomats are from countries. So she's not a diplomat. And she's not an official of any recognized country. So she gets to go through passport control. That was a really nice gesture. Then Janet Yellen gets fed some strange mushrooms that are then leaked, fake report of them being hallucinogenic, which should explain some of her bizarre behavior in trying to convince China to not grow its economy so much because it causes a trade imbalance with the United States. Silliness like that. And then Scholz flies to China and is received by the head of a provincial Chinese city as part of the protocol, because that's really his status. Nobody elected him head of Germany. That is just party politics. But really, what he is a Bürgermeister of a German town. That is basically when he was promoted past that point, he was promoted past his level of competence. And the Chinese know that. They know that he's a nobody. And what the Chinese were actually interested in, and the only reason they received him, was because he had in tow a large number of German industrialists who are running away from Germany as fast as they can and trying to get as much help and cooperation as possible from the Chinese in relocating their businesses and manufacturing facilities to China. So basically, there's Scholz basically making mouth music to the sheet music provided by Washington. And what's really happening is Germany is losing its industrial base as quickly as it can manage. And these are the sorts of things that go on. Blinken flies over there and, he looks like a whipped dog when he says these rude things that the Chinese find absolutely unspeakable, like China should stop cooperating with Russia. Well, no. The answer is no. China is not going to stop cooperating with Russia. That's the final answer. And he can't actually go back and say, well, China said no. That's the funny thing about it. He goes back and says, we had some constructive discussions and spent time looking for some common ground, blah, 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 and etc. And I made the Chinese understand that, blah, 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 etc. So it's all a joke.
When you look at the way that the United States is managing Japan, and right now it's much more important Philippines to do some sort of to contain China and to make some sort of political move against China. Do you think that we've heard that one of the American commander last year said that in 2025 we're gonna fight with China. Do you think that they're preparing for such a move on China? Because right now in Philippines, they're trying to do some sort of political actions, political movement against China. How do you see these new movements? Some of them are new, some of them are pretty old. How do you see the policy when it comes to that region? China, Japan, Philippines. How do you see this?
Well, the Philippines is kind of a banana republic. It's it flip-flops between being very pro-American and being somewhat anti-American. Um, and it all has to do with money. So as long as the Americans can throw some money at the Philippines, there will periodically be a pro-American Philippine government. As far as fighting China, have you asked the Filipinos if they want to fight China or not? Because that's a key question. And the answer is that the Philippines will not fight China. They will take American money and American weapons, but they will not use them to fight China, nor will anyone else. And the funny thing is that the Americans won't fight China either, because what can they do? Taiwan is all the way on the other side of a very large ocean. And if an American fleet decides to sail over and not just show the flag and just sort of waste their time, but actually try to go on attack and be threatening, how many U.S. Aircraft carriers have to be sunk before the United States decides that it can no longer do anything about China and just folds? Of course, the United States doesn't want to lose any of its precious aircraft carriers, so it'll only deploy them in areas where it can be sure that hostilities are very unlikely. And if hostilities do erupt, it'll hide them somewhere, or it'll invent some kind of crisis somewhere else. But there isn't going to be a war between the United States and China, because the United States would only last maybe a month or two without Chinese spare parts for its industry. It'll just all grind to a halt. And the United States has no ability to replace Chinese industry at this point, because it's all about the money. And the people with the money don't want to invest in industrial production for the sake of then losing a war. That's just incredibly stupid and money losing. So I don't think anything is going to happen. I think it's all just posturing.
We've heard that NATO Secretary General Stoltenberg said that we're going to increase the number of nuclear bombs in Europe. It simply says that the United States is going to send more nuclear bombs to Europe to be placed in Europe. And do you think when it comes to when this policy, they're trying to send some sort of message to Russia or China? Because we already know that it's obviously that they're talking to Russia. But do you think they're sending some sort of message to China as well?
I really have no idea what having more old bombs, some of them are 30, 40 years old, will do. nobody has any idea whether any of them will explode, because these are radioactive things that sit there and basically destroy themselves with neutron bombardment over the years and become less and less reliable. And there's no way to judge whether any of them are any good for anything except, making a radioactive mess. And the other thing is that NATO and the US, neither of them has up-to-date delivery systems for any of this stuff. The Minuteman hasn't made it out of its silo on its own power since anyone can remember. The last time they tried to test a Trident from a submarine, it almost killed the UK Secretary of Defense, Minister of Defense, because it started spinning in the air instead of flying on a trajectory. And then the other big nuclear bomb delivery system they have is the Tomahawk, which flies slower than a passenger jet and is very easy to shoot down using Russia's up-to-date defenses or China's or Iran's. And so the calculation behind launching a nuclear attack is impossible. It's not just bad math, it's non-existent math. Nobody knows what the results would be. It could just be nothing. And so it doesn't matter how many duds you have in your arsenal. If you think that they might be duds, and if you think that there might be half of them might be duds, you don't really have a game. You don't have a game plan. So again, they're talking about numbers of nuclear bombs that probably don't work. And what good is that?
And the third country receiving the aid from the United States is Israel. We had tumultuous days between, there was a total mess between Israel and Iran. They were attacking each other. And when it comes to this interaction, these attacks from Iran to Israel, Israel to Iran, how did you find it? Israelis attack Iran to respond what Iran did to them. And how did you find these interactions, these unbelievable interactions between Iran and Israel? For the first time, Iran is attacking Israel directly. That was a big deal, in my opinion. And Israel wanted to respond, and after that they said, after hours of talking, that Israel is attacking Iran at a level we haven't seen before, and they're attacking viciously. And then after that came out new articles that say that Israel decided to scale down the attack on Iran because they didn't want to widen the war. What's your take?
Well, the action by Iran took me by surprise. I thought that this might happen at some point. I just didn't think that Iran was altogether ready for it. Well, it was ready for it, and it executed the operation in comfort and style, I would say. So what happened is that Israel did the unspeakable thing of blowing up the Iranian embassy in Damascus and killing a bunch of people, including some highly placed Iranian officials. Now, destroying an embassy and generally mistreating emissaries and ambassadors is absolutely unspeakable when it comes to international law, starting with the days of Genghis Khan. If you look at Genghis Khan's criminal code, called the Great Yasa, there's an article in it that says anybody who mistreats my emissaries will have their city destroyed and its inhabitants slaughtered. The end. So he actually did that to a couple of cities that were unwise enough to mistreat its emissaries, his emissaries. So Iran did something much more, let's say, civilized than what Genghis Khan would do. What Genghis Khan would do would be to raise Tel Aviv and kill all of its inhabitants. Iran didn't do that. what Iran did instead was completely saturate the air defense systems, not just of Israel, but of Israel's allies, including the United States, the United Kingdom, France, and Jordan. Basically, it sent in enough really, really cheap drones to costing, I don't know how much, tens of thousands of dollars probably. But by doing so, it wasted somewhere around a little over, some people say a little over $2 billion worth of air defense rockets on the Israeli side, the American side, the French, the British, the Jordanian side. So the other thing to keep in mind is that it launched some number of hypersonic rockets, which the Israelis could not stop. If these rockets were nuclear tipped, which Iran could do, and in a pinch it could come up with some nuclear bombs and launch them at Israel, then Israel would no longer exist. It would cease to exist. But instead, what Iran did was basically a demonstration project showing that, yes, we have hypersonic weapons, just like Russia, just like China, just like North Korea, and not just like any of NATO, which doesn't have any hypersonic rockets at all and doesn't know how to make them. And we can hit any spot in Israel we want to for any reason. So they demonstrated that. And then the other thing to keep in mind is that the Iranian stockpile of what they threw at Israel this time, which is basically silly, relatively silly, cheap drones and old ballistic ballistic rockets. Some of them Israel shot down, some of them probably didn't. It has a stockpile of those big enough to basically stage this kind of an attack on Israel every single day for a couple of years. And what will happen to Israel if once its air defense systems are depleted completely, if all of the scrap keeps raining from the sky on Israeli towns and cities? What will happen after that is Israel will depopulate and will cease to exist. And the thing to keep in mind is that Israel has lost a third to a quarter of its economy since they started their genocidal campaign in Gaza and the West Bank. And you can only go so far in losing, a third of your economy a year before you don't really have a country. So Israel's path is towards existence failure, you might say, even without Iran doing anything. But this demonstration project was very useful in telling Israel that it is no longer the top dog in the region. It can no longer just hit anything it wants and think it can get away with it. That from now on, when it misbehaves, it is going to basically at least be embarrassed enough to stop. And so what we saw after that in ineffectual drone attacks on Iran was basically an internal face-saving maneuver. Look, we did something, and we can lie about it. But that was basically it. The Iranians pretty much stood around and laughed as the attack was happening.
Do you think this aid to Israel would be some sort of aid that Biden did to just convince them not to attack Rafah, or they're totally getting along with the Netanyahu administration to attack Rafah?
I don't think it has anything to do with that. There's inertia built into the system. They keep sending weapons to Israel, and they have to keep sending weapons to Israel because otherwise somebody won't get their kickback. There's also a very powerful Jewish Israeli lobby in the United States that politicians are afraid of. All of those things are much more important than the relationship between Biden and Netanyahu. And Netanyahu knows this, and he's a rude boy. He knows that he can pretty much get away with anything. Biden can tell him not to do something, and he will do it anyway. And at some point, it will, well, I think it's already started happening. If you look at what's been happening on university campuses lately in the United States, basically everybody, even the Jews, hate what Israel is doing. So the Israeli lobby is very steadily and faster losing the younger Jewish population. These people no longer want to countenance the existence of this, rabidly fascist Israeli state that is perpetuating genocide against the Palestinians. And so I think that these two things are clashing more and more. The fact that the United States can't stop itself from supplying more and more weapons to Israel, and the fact that basically politically, even among Biden and Democrat supporters, there's less and less support for Israel and pro-Israeli politicians and politics. That is an internal political conflict within the United States that will result in a great deal of misdirected rage over the next election cycle or two, and is not a good thing for Israel in the long run. In the short run, Israel, after its tussle with Iran, refusing to be as humiliated as it should be, has gone back to what it does best, which is genocide against the Palestinians. And it'll continue doing that for as long as it can get away with it, which seems to be going okay for it for now.
Do you think if Trump wins, what would happen to Gaza? What would happen to Rafah? I mean, let's see. We know that Biden right now doesn't have a great chance of winning in 2024. And we know that the alternative would be Donald Trump. None of them is good for any of these conflicts in Ukraine, in Taiwan, in Israel. But in case Trump wins, what does it mean for Gaza and Rafah?
What does it mean if Trump wins? Well, you can sort of game it out a little bit. Okay, so basically they want to lock up Trump for 100 years or something ridiculous like that for some victimless crime that he didn't commit, because the justice system in the United States is just that bad. Okay, so suppose they lock him up, and suppose he gets elected. Well, after being elected, a US president has to be inaugurated, and as part of the inauguration, has to be installed in the White House. So Congress would have to pass a bill making the White House into a federal penitentiary. And then Trump could basically show up for work at the federal penitentiary called the White House, pardon himself. Since now he's president, he can pardon anybody. He would pardon himself, and then Congress could repeal that law, making the White House into a federal penitentiary. So that would be an interesting thing. That's if he gets elected. And if Biden gets elected, given how popular he is now, well, he's still very popular among the dead people. And there's more dead people than alive people in the United States. And if all the dead people vote for Biden, then he would definitely win in every single state. So there wouldn't be a problem. Which is to say that the whole election thing is a complete joke. And how that reflects on some place that Americans can't even find on a map, like Gaza, that they don't really care about very much, except for some, young people on university campuses who are always protesting anyway. Well, I don't know. I really don't know.